Hello, and welcome to Mystic Dog Mama, the podcast for soul led dog mamas, where you'll discover how to best nourish your dog and yourself, mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Dr. Alexia Meller. Hi there, thank you for joining me today. I'm so glad to have you here for this week's conversation with canine nutritionist and holistic pet health coach, Kat Jepson, where we talk all about pancreatitis. I invited Kat on the podcast at this particular time to chat all things pancreatitis and how we can consider diet to potentially prevent and manage it, because we see a real uptick in hospitalizations for pancreatitis around this time of year when we might get tempted to feed our dogs extra goodies like cooked turkey skin. Pancreatitis is a really serious condition that causes incredible pain, and if you suspect your dog has it, you need to see your vet immediately. So, we're going to talk to you about why you might want to avoid sharing the turkey skin with your dog and what you can do with the diet if your dog does develop pancreatitis. In this conversation, you'll learn about Kat's journey into canine nutrition via her sweet Boston Terrier pups, Betty and Boris, who presented with various health challenges themselves. When it comes to pancreatitis, Kat shares some of her perspectives on it, and we dive into things like what the pancreas is and what's happening when pancreatitis hits, common symptoms of pancreatitis to keep an eye out for, potential causes of pancreatitis, whether you're feeding kibble or fresh food, some thoughts on how you might want to consider approaching things like essential fatty acids for a dog with pancreatitis, and why a DIY approach to your dog's diet might be the most helpful approach to manage a pancreatitis flare-up and to prevent it. There's so much to cover when it comes to pancreatitis, and there's no way we would be able to do it all in this episode. And there's also no single approach to it, as every dog's situation will be different. I highly encourage you to speak with your veterinarian and your nutrition consultant about any potential dietary changes you're considering making, just to make sure that you're making informed choices for your dog. While Kat and I speak about general dietary considerations when it comes to dealing with pancreatitis, this should absolutely not be construed as medical advice, and it in no means replaces speaking with your vet. That being said, if you enjoy research rabbit holes and you'd like to learn more about pancreatitis, stay tuned through the outro where I'll share some additional resources that you might find helpful. Now, before we dive in, just a quick note that this episode is sponsored by Aspirationary, which in full transparency is another project of mine where we create books, notebooks, and stationery to support you in becoming all you aspire to be. I'm really excited to announce that we have released a Spanish language version of our popular My First Period tracker for young girls and tweens, in order to increase menstrual literacy and empower young people to become advocates for their menstrual health. You can learn more about our books on our Instagram, which is Aspirationary, spelled Aspirationery. Okay, on that note, let's go. Hi, Kat. Thank you so much for joining me on the Mystic Dog Mama podcast today. I'm so thrilled that you're here.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Oh, I'm really excited. And just to let the audience know why I wanted to have this conversation with you, you are a fellow canine nutritionist, and I love your approach to caring for dogs, to nourishing dogs, to really being conscious about the food systems that we're involved in, all of that, and kind of pulling those puzzle pieces together. And I think that's such an important thing to bring to the conversation. But you also are really passionate about how we can support disease states through food as well. And I wanted to talk to you about a particular condition that we see, especially in the US. There's a spike of this, it seems like every vet is dealing with multiple cases of it around this time as we enter into the holiday season, and that is pancreatitis. So we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into pancreatitis and get people familiar with what it is, what causes it, and how they can actually support their dogs through it. So I'm very excited. All
Yeah, me too. I think it's definitely part of the puzzle that is missing at the moment, I think, with lots of the sick, we'll call them sick dogs. They're not some of them might not seem very sick, but that is what the problem is. We've got several different situations like chronic allergies all the time and everything like that. And there just seems to be so much emphasis on the conventional methods, which, don't get me wrong, are fabulous in the way that they can help support and navigate a condition, but the opportunities that we have from providing, optimal nutrition to these dogs can change the course of their recovery, tenfold if it's done correctly. And that's, why I'm so passionate about it, because nutrition is so easy to implement when when you've got a plan to follow. And I think it's underrated for a lot of people, or underrated by a lot of people. So that, same as you, we just try and make a difference by spreading what we know. But yeah, I'm super excited to talk about pancreatitis. I've been wanting to talk about it for a while, but I've sometimes I get what's the word, when I'm trying to organize my thoughts. So I thought, right, I'm going to put that off on my own page for a bit, just until better. But no, thank you for inviting me on, because it's one of the, well, I say it's one of the favorite things to deal with. It's not my favorite thing to deal with in terms of, because it's such a horrible condition. But I think, because it's so serious, the way that you can support it with food is absolutely magnificent.
So, Kat, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what catalyzed your journey into canine nutrition, because I think there's, for those of us in the industry, there's always that one dog or two dogs that kind of start the journey. And I wonder what your story is with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, unfortunately, my journey began from a place of pain, which is uncommon for people who work in this industry, and obviously for the people that come to us for help. Um, so we always had dogs growing up. So I've always been around dogs. I've always loved dogs, and my mum is dog obsessed as well. So I think, I probably get a little bit from her. But I first became a dog mum in 2016 when I got two Boston Terriers, Betty and Boris. And just like the majority of people back then and even now, I was, straight to the supermarket, getting a bag of dog food, doing all the things that you think you should do when you get a puppy, in terms of kind of like flea and worm treatment, vaccinations, and all that kind of thing. Which for the first year or so, it went okay. And then in the second year, Betty actually started to become very poorly. She like stopped eating, and she had deformed legs. Like, she didn't grow like a typical Boston Terrier. So she had a lot of problems anyway. But one of the things was that I used to take her to the vets and tell them that she wasn't eating. And they told me that it was because her legs were painful. So they prescribed like things like gabapentin and painkillers, and also some beautiful wet food on prescription, to syringe feed her in order to get the nutrition in, which I was doing, obviously. And it just didn't work. And then one day she kind of went into a massive seizure. And then she went into what you call status epilepticus, which is where they basically don't really come out of a seizure. They might kind of stop convulsing, but they're kind of stuck in a vacant state. And then that usually just goes into another seizure. And she just didn't really come out of it. So she had a few hospital stays. We couldn't use drugs to get it back under control. And we had like an MRI and everything like that. But because of all the seizures and stuff, she just had extensive brain damage, and then ended up having severe inflammatory brain disease. So at that point, we had to make the heartbreaking decision to kind of let her go. And because she had deformed legs, I mean, I'm not saying I cared about her more than any other dog, but I think because she was disabled anyway, and we'd been doing fundraising to try and raise money for surgery to make her legs better and everything like that, it just really did hit me hard, because I was caring for her so much more than what you would think a dog would typically need anyway. And at that point, I had no idea about nutrition or anything. And it wasn't until afterwards that I was, kind of doing a bit of research into why could that have happened? Because Boris, her brother, then started having seizures, and was diagnosed with epilepsy. as well. So I was like trying to figure out, that was a very, very stressful time for me because obviously we just lost Betty to a similar thing. And then Boris started having seizures. So I was petrified that the same thing was going to happen to him. And basically, that's what sent me straight down the rabbit hole into looking at different ways that we can help to support our pets, as well as kind of like using the typical methods that are advised by our vets. Um, and I just went from there. So it first started with figuring out, what kind of diet could affect Boris's epilepsy and different kind of like herbs I could use. And it wasn't until afterwards we kind of realized that his was largely to do with stress. That came like a few years into the journey. Um, but that's where it began. And then I also had another Boston Terrier, Barney. So I've got Boris and Barney are still here now, thankfully. And Barney has he's had a few gut problems, but he's always eaten fresh food. So following what happened with Betty, they they've always been on raw food since then because that was kind of like the first thing that I discovered. But when I say raw food, I mean literally just like an 80-10-10 pre-made food with, just swapping the different proteins every day and not really adding anything else to the bowl. It was literally just something like that. And then Boris's epilepsy had been like kind of managed with medication, but then Barney started to have kind of like GI issues and like reflux and things like that. So it was trying to find ways to kind of structure their diet to suit them because they're already on fresh food. So I was thinking, well, why are they having these problems? Because they're eating fresh food. And I was like trying different proteins and trying to do elimination diets and everything, especially with Barney, who was throwing up after every meal. And that is basically what led me to branch out into all of these different ways into kind of how you structure the diet, what needs to be in there, whether it's a fat thing, and all that kind of stuff. So it has been a very, very rough journey from the beginning, but the past 4 years have been very, very rewarding in, what we have seen come out of the nutrition and how we can now manage our lifestyle because I have that knowledge and information.
Oh, I love that. That's so helpful for people to hear as well because there is hope, and I love, and we'll talk about this later on in the podcast. But helping people to understand that putting together meals for your dogs isn't as difficult as it's maybe made out to seem, and actually in taking control of what's going into the bowl and customizing that for your dog can be the most loving decision that you make for your dog and for yourself too, because there's just such a wonderful experience of knowing that you are putting that love into the bowl and you're delivering what it is that they need. And what I love about your approach too with DIY in particular is because I share that same ethos that you can constantly respond to where your dog is in any given moment.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
totally customize it. Yeah.
Yeah. And if it's like because you know exactly what's going in and in what amount, you know that when you do try something new, or if something does happen, you can pretty much exactly pinpoint what's gone wrong and rectify it without having to dissect the whole diet and start from scratch with something, unbeknown to you. So that is the beauty of where we are now because I've kept meticulous records of everything they've eaten and the different, even just from minced to chunks. Like Barney just can't tolerate minced food. He just can't. It doesn't sit well with him. It gives him reflux. So he has to have chunks, which obviously is DIY. But without trialing all of these different things and then building the bowl from the ground up, you just wouldn't be able to gather such a wealth of knowledge to be able to help your dog on their journey as their needs change.
Exactly. Exactly. No, I love that. And I think that kind of approach is particularly useful for issues like we're going to talk about today with something like pancreatitis, where you can start really controlling and seeing what it is that's affecting your dog and take immediate response for that or to that. So, are we ready to dive in? Do we want to talk about what
Yeah,
it is?
absolutely. Yeah, we can do.
Yay! Yay! So when a pet parent is told their dog has pancreatitis, I think a lot of times it's like, what does that even mean? So what is pancreatitis? What's going on with that?
Okay, so the pancreas is a secreting organ that lives in the abdomen, and it's got two roles basically. It's got the exocrine role, which means that it produces and releases digestive enzymes, which help your dog digest their food, basically. And then the endocrine role, where it produces and releases insulin to help control blood sugar levels in the bloodstream, and that's released directly into the bloodstream. So now realistically, because the pancreas is essentially a bag of digestive enzymes, it is always susceptible to being constantly inflamed. And it's quite remarkable why it doesn't become inflamed even within normal functioning. So when you do have pancreatitis, it's because the pancreas has become inflamed. So it's inflammation of the pancreas, as like, if it ends in itis, it's to do with the inflammation. And it is, I mean, I've never suffered from it, but it is meant to be one of the most painful conditions that you could ever have, or that your dog could ever have as well. So that's essentially what it is. Now, it can present itself in an acute problem where you really need to kind of get your dog to the vet immediately because they're at risk, of losing their life. But it can also be present without you even knowing as what we call like a smoldering effect, where there's like a low grade inflammation, which kind of like builds up over time. But the way that the pancreas prevents itself from becoming inflamed, a lot of people tend to think that pancreatitis is caused by high fat diets. Now, that is a contributing factor to it, but that's not the whole story. The way it stops itself from becoming constantly inflamed is through the blood flow. And that has a lot to do with things like nitric oxide as well. Do you want me to just carry on
Go
like
for
talking
it.
about, yeah?
You go for it. Go
I
for it.
didn't know if you wanted to keep asking questions as I
No,
was going.
this is good. This is good because I think, people, it's helpful when you start to understand like what's actually going on with the body and why is this related to this and kind of giving people something to sort of think about because I think like something like pancreatitis, it's first of all, how many of us actually know, like you said, what the pancreas is really doing, what the role is in the body? And so when you start to put these pieces together, it's like, okay, I can start to get to grips with what's actually going on with my dog. So you run with it.
Yeah. Okay. 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 So I'm gonna kind of try and illustrate what happens when your dog has pancreatitis, just to try and make it easier. So if you think about the pancreas as being a house that is on fire, and then if you think about the blood flow being a bunch of firemen with their hoses kind of putting out the fire. So this house is constantly trying to burn itself down, but yet when you've got sufficient blood flow to the pancreas, then you've got a sufficient water being put on the fire, which keeps it under control. Now, if you want these firemen to continue working effectively all day to put out the fire, then they're going to need something to fuel them and make sure that they're working correctly. Now, this is nitric oxide, and nitric oxide is basically what helps the endothelial cells, which are part of the blood vessels. So the endothelial cells are the blood vessels, and they help to provide the blood flow to the pancreas. So if you have your house that's on fire and you've got a sufficient ring of firemen around it putting the fire out because they're having their packed lunch, which is the nitric oxide, then you have a well-controlled fire, which is the bag of the digestive enzymes. Now, if you kind of take away the lunchbox for the firemen, they're going to get tired, they're going to want to go to sleep, they're not going to continue spraying the water on this fire. So when this happens, because there's a depletion of nitric oxide, the blood vessels then begin to die and they begin to basically become leaky. And that essentially means that the fire can burn out of control. So, although it is very much thought of as a fat issue, it's more to do with the blood flow surrounding the pancreas, which can be affected by the fat as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what's helpful with what you're pointing to as well is remembering that the body is an ecosystem. It's
Yeah.
things aren't isolated to one area, that everything is interconnected. And so it's often helpful to sort of take a step back and look at what else is going on. Or like in the case of inflammatory conditions, I would argue that whether it's pancreatitis or any other itis, we need to take a step back and look at where is the inflammation in the body as a whole, because that's going to be affecting why it's showing up as an exacerbated issue in a particular place. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And with pancreatitis, I mean, you not all dogs will end up in hospital with pancreatitis, and that is basically it's dependent on their energetic constitution, in terms of Chinese herbal medicine, and it's largely to do with the kind of environment, diet, lifestyle that they are in as well. Now, the when the blood vessels are not receiving enough of the nitric oxide and there's lack of blood flow, we call this endothelial dysfunction, which is, the main reason why the pancreas becomes inflamed in the first place. Now, this is what starts the inflammatory process going. So this is kind of what starts the smoldering aspect, and this can go unnoticed. So you're probably not going to see many symptoms when this is happening. But then you have other contributing factors that can come and make the inflammation worse, and that depends on kind of the different constitutions of the dog. Now, in terms of Chinese herbal medicine, pancreatitis can be caused by what we call damp heat, with a deficiency of the spleen, or it can be like a blood deficiency or like an energy disharmony within the body. And then this is where it becomes different, and whether you get a dog that's eating processed food that gets pancreatitis, or you have a dog that eats fresh food that gets pancreatitis. Because a lot of people think, I'm just going to feed the dog fresh food and they won't get pancreatitis, because there's all this, hoo-ha made about processed food causes pancreatitis and high fat and things like that, which it does, but a poorly structured raw food diet can also contribute to this this as well.
Mm-hmm.
So now the reason that pancreatitis becomes a problem is because of different reasons with each different kind of dog. So you've got the dog that eats the processed food, which is the damp heat condition. And now pancreatitis comes to these dogs because they are what we called they receive overnutrition from processed food. So they receive a lot of things that aren't getting used effectively. They tend to be kind of overweight. They have their flare-ups in the midsummer to the autumn time. They have a lot of kind of hot symptoms, so they don't tolerate the heat well. They might have excessive thirst and things like that. And they do have kind of a history of inflammatory diseases. So they might have problems with their anal glands, or they might have problems with their ears or the underbelly, their skin and things like that. So there is a history of inflammation already there. They can be kind of prone to weight gain, and things like that. And this basically means, because when you have something in terms of Chinese medicine, if you have something that circulates, if you have something that's within the body that's not getting used, that is what causes the dampness, and that is what can contribute to the inflammation. So if you think you've already got this problem with the reduced blood flow because of the lack of nitric oxide, because of a deficient diet and that kind of thing, and then you've got these other symptoms as well,
Mm-hmm.
which can then lead to pancreatic explosions. Now, this is where the fat comes in from, like the Thanksgiving dinners when you're feeding cooked turkey skin, which is why we see an increase of dogs going to the hospital around this time, because they've probably already got a smoldering pancreas, which you don't really know about because they're there's hardly any symptoms. And then what can happen is when you've got too much fat stored in the body, then the cells can't really do much with it. So then it circulates around the body, and it reduces the blood flow even more to the pancreas, which is how then you get the blow up of the inflammation. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It does make sense. And I think too, like it's helpful to say as well that there are differences between cooked fats and uncooked fats with how your
Oh yeah.
dogs body engages it. So the cooked turkey fat, that's often why you see kind of almost like an immediate response, like Thanksgiving Day, because the cooked
Yeah.
fat will be not very well processed by your dog's body. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's all to do with how the nutrients are digested and absorbed. So if you think about with processed food and cooked fats and cooked food, they're literally absorbed really quickly, which is another reason why it can contribute to the pancreatitis, because it's like it causes the fat levels in the bloodstream to increase, but also insulin to spike, especially if you've got high carbohydrates, like what you would see with processed foods. And the pancreas, as we know, is all part of controlling the insulin levels in the blood. Now, if you have constant elevated fat levels and constant spikes of insulin, the body loses its ability to be able to regulate those two things, which is how they can then accumulate and cause problems such as inflammation. Because, you know, as we know, obesity is a inflammatory condition, and so is diabetes, which a dog can actually get diabetes from these kinds of things. If from a smoldering pancreas, it can cause diabetes in the dog as well. So cooked fat is absorbed a lot more readily than what raw fat is, because the dog's body has to work for its nutrients when it's in its raw state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, that makes total sense. It makes total sense because um it helps to sort of demystify the conversation around fats because I think, in our human, and I'm going to talk about from a Western perspective, we've been told for years fat is bad for you. Avoid fat, all the low fat processed foods, all, that kind of a thing. So I think we've sort of absorbed that, even though all that stuff is not good for you. Just going to put that out there that it's not about low fat, right? But we have then assigned that to our dogs too. So we get really afraid, especially if our dog has a history of pancreatitis, or even if they had it one time and you've gone through that experience of having to take them to the vet and it's absolutely awful, you're
Yeah.
terrified of triggering it again. And I think often we're applying that sort of the human conditioning, the inappropriate, wrong human conditioning that we've had around fats, and we apply that to our dogs. And so we're like, oh my God, absolutely no fat. And we do want to look at lean meats. We do want to look at lower fat diets for pancreatitis. But I think making that distinction, why the dog has the attack on Thanksgiving is because of the cooked fats triggering that
Yeah.
versus fat
Yeah.
being a bad thing in general, because your dog needs fat.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. They do. And with anything, it's all about moderation. And this kind of brings me into the other, which is the dogs on a fresh food diet who also suffer from this horrific condition. And that's because their diet isn't structured appropriately. It can often be because they have high fat diets in terms of kind of like a lot of poultry skin, and that can be raw as well. And a lot of these kind of issues come from pre-made foods, which everybody knows that I talk about so so often. But a lot of the time, especially if you're choosing a budget brand, I know especially here in the UK, I'm not really sure what it's like where you are. But they use a lot of poultry carcass and skin and things like that in the pre-mades. And because people obviously they've got a tight budget and they want to feed fresh food, this is what a lot of the dogs are getting, which can cause a problem in its own sense because there's a bit too much fat in there for what the dog can tolerate. But in terms of dogs that eat fresh food, it's more to do with the state of the gut and systemic inflammation. So it's usually because there's leaky gut in happening in this dog already, which is causing the smoldering inflammation of the pancreas. So if you think about what leaky gut is, we know it's basically a gut that doesn't have a good defense system in terms of the gut lining integrity and the microbiome army, basically, who are there to defend the gut and to keep it strong, to keep it healthy. Now, pancreatitis for fresh food dogs is more commonly in those that don't have any plant material in their diets. And this is because the plant material is what feeds the microbiome and helps to keep it in fully working order, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So what happens in these kind of dogs is that they have they've already kind of got endothelial dysfunction, smoldering in the background because of a poorly structured fresh food diet. But then when systemic inflammation comes along, which is a result of leaky gut, because what happens when the gut becomes leaky and we lose that integrity of the gut lining, we let the bad guys in and they wreak havoc, and you lose your ability to control the immune system. It basically just goes off and does whatever it wants. And this is, you know, going up to the pancreas that's already a little bit inflamed and saying, hey, you're not as inflamed as what you should be. You need to ramp it up a bit. And that's basically what happens because, inflammation doesn't just stay in one area. If you've got systemic inflammation, it's just going everywhere. And that's why you can see this condition in the fresh fed dogs as well, because this is what happens. So, I think it is one of the big misconceptions that if you feed a dog fresh food that they won't get pancreatitis. Everybody needs to kind of pay attention to what they are feeding their dog, in order to kind of minimize those risks and to really focus on the gut health as well, because the gut rules the roost.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, we were talking before recording about how when some people can come to you as a nutrition consultant for a variety of different ailments, but generally it starts, I mean, the very first thing that we end up doing is looking at the gut. It doesn't matter what it is, because that is where health starts. Whether that's from a Chinese medicine perspective, that's where they believe that health starts. Whether it's from a Western perspective, we're learning more and more I mean, thousands of articles are coming out weekly on the role of the gut microbiome in everything. And so we do always start there. And like you said, systemic inflammation is happening throughout the body. It's just kind of showing up where there are weak areas in your body or in your
Mm-hmm.
dog's body, and that can be related to constitution, for example, or that can also be certain breeds are more predisposed to certain ailments. And so when you start to take all of those factors together, as well as to your point with the DIY, really following what's working for your dog. So even though we might say roughly a dog needs 80% muscle meat, and within that, you've also got like heart or lung, different types of muscle, roughly 10% organs, roughly 10% bone, doesn't mean that your
Yeah,
dog can actually eat that. Your dog's
yeah,
profile might look very different. And so when you're coming from a DIY perspective, you have total control. And the idea is that you're monitoring your dog, seeing what's working for them, and you just adjust accordingly. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think if your dog is diagnosed with something as serious as pancreatitis, even if it's low grade, then you do need to pay attention. You do need to take control, because if you leave that smoldering fire to just keep on smoldering and you don't make any changes, it can then lead to an explosion, what we call an explosion, where it'll become severely inflamed and your dog will be hospitalized
Right.
and might even lose their life because of it, because it can be fatal
Yeah.
if your dog ends up in hospital with it as well, because it can be really hard to kind of get back under control once like a fire, once a fire burns out of control. um and that's where we need to think about how we structure our dog's diet. And I mean I bang on about it all the time about DIY and how you need to look at your individual dog's needs. And this is why, because you could be feeding your dog a fresh food diet and think that everything's okay, um, and they don't have any symptoms, but they could have some slight inflammation in their pancreas, which could then turn into a bit of a problem.
Mhm.
And it's the smoldering pancreas that can then go on to cause problems like diabetes
Yeah.
or even exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, EPI, because it inhibits the pancreas's ability to do its job, and that is to produce and release the digestive enzymes for the food and to regulate the insulin levels as well. It's very, very serious,
Yeah.
and I think one of the main things that I try to achieve by helping people to kind of look at their dog as an individual and do the DIY diet is to just, there's only a few boxes that you have to tick in terms of how to structure the diet to, promote optimal health and keep them under the threshold. Even if your dog has pancreatitis, you can structure the diet in a way. If they're having a flare up, you can go really, really low fat, because the body needs that at this moment in time to prevent any kind of more severe inflammation. But then even if they've, been diagnosed with pancreatitis and you get them out of the woods, you can still put more fat back into the diet. You just got to keep it under a certain amount. And when you are buying pre-made food, you cannot guarantee that that fat level and is what it is, because the fat listed on the label is the minimum, it's not the maximum. Whereas when you piece in the bowl together bit by bit, you can see the fat, so you know if it's got a lot of fat in it or not, which is, why we've got to do these things.
No, exactly, exactly. So I think, Kat, it would be helpful if I know that for chronic pancreatitis, there's not necessarily really obvious symptoms, but there are symptoms. You'll start to notice certain things, a pattern of certain things, but for acute, there are. Could we maybe talk a little bit about how you might recognize that your dog might have pancreatitis? And then we can talk about, from your perspective, how do we support that from the diet?
Yeah. Okay. So you'll know there's something wrong with your dog if they're having an acute onset of pancreatitis, because they will be very, very unwell. They won't be responsive very much. They'll be kind of listless. They'll be vomiting, diarrhea, extreme lethargy, that kind of thing. They will be very, very sick. So if you know they have kind of eaten a load of cooked turkey skin and then they start to behave this way, then you
Mhm.
need to get them immediately. Now, so they are. It's when there's a combination of these symptoms that are all together. The main ones being kind of like the unresponsiveness, and
Mhm.
they're just not interested in anything, and you're trying to talk to them, and they're just basically too sick to do anything. And that's how you would know that
Yeah.
your dog might have an issue with pancreatitis. As well, if they do have any abdominal pain, because it is very painful,
Yeah.
which in contrast to kind of like the smoldering fire, there are some symptoms that might kind of signify, such as, mo- like bilious vomit in the morning can be a symbol of like a low grade pancreatitis. It can be kind of stomach cramps after eating, that kind of thing. It can also be things like how their skin is. So if you've got like a damp dog that can have like quite oily skin and that kind of thing, whether if it's a fresh fed dog, they're more likely to be dry. So there are some symptoms and like
Mm.
different patterns and stuff. Like you say, every so many weeks they might have like a few days where they vomit up bile on the morning and they don't want to eat for a few days, and then they go back to normal, and that could be a sign that they do have kind of low grade pancreatitis. So
Yeah.
it's just, again, this is where the beauty of paying attention to your dog and knowing their normal behaviors really kind of pays off, because then you'll know if something's off.
Yeah.
Even if it's just something slight, like, they've got a bit of a low mood, or if they've been sick that morning.
Yeah, definitely. And, you were mentioning about taking meticulous notes, keeping records of what your dog's reading. And I do the same thing with Lucky. I think it's so helpful. So if you start to notice like, just because they have bilious bile vomiting in the morning doesn't necessarily mean it. But again, I mean, it could be they've got the hunger
Yeah.
pukes. So we're not
Yeah.
saying jump to the worst conclusion, but when you start to see this pattern, mark it down, because then it gives you something that you can talk to your vet about and have them check it. Another symptom that I've heard is kind of like one that people pick up on quite a bit is noticing that their dogs have like a hunched back, that they're sort of, because of the abdominal pain, they're holding themselves funnily. So if you even start to notice like the way that your dog is holding their body changes, make a note of that
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, and sometimes if they go into like a praying position after
Yeah.
eating as well, which could signify some discomfort in the abdomen as well. But I think if this is a normal behavior for your dog or not. We're not just talking about, the greeting stretch where, they stand up and they do a big stretch. If you can then, when you take notice of what time it happens and how frequently it happens, then you can see if there's a pattern and kind
Mhm.
of go from there. But I mean, there's really easy ways of kind of checking to see if there is an issue with pancreatitis, and you could just have a blood test, which could test the levels of the lipase and the amylase in the blood, and that could give you an indication if they are higher than normal, to kind of indicate if there could be something smoldering in the background.
Right. Right. No, that's really helpful. So from a fresh perspective, so we're saying too, like some of the causes for pancreatitis, processed foods are definitely part of it. So anything that's going to be kind of inflammatory. So we're going to say in this conversation, we've already let you know, get off the kibble if you can do that. But so we're going to look at how do we actually support the dog from a fresh food perspective? What might that look like for a chronic condition?
Okay, so the diet needs to be relatively low in fat. And when you're talking about percentage wise, if you talk from a dry matter basis, you want it to be less than 30% fat. And you also want it to be less than 30% starch as well. Starch and sugars, which comes from, carbohydrates. Now, that's not to say you can't include things like butternut squash and sweet potato and things like that in the diet. If that's what you want to feed your dog, you can. You just need to make sure there's not too much of it, because these are the things that are going to contribute to the onset, and make the situation worse. The food obviously is better unprocessed, because it's better for the dog to have to work for their nutrients. They have to digest the food. They need to be able to use their digestive enzymes that are going to digest the food. They need to know what to do with the fat that's in the food. They need to be able to stop the fat storage. So if your dog's overweight, you need to keep them at a nice lean level, because excess fat causes inflammation anyway in itself. And your dog needs to be able to control their insulin levels as well. So you don't want to be giving them too many spikes of sugar and starch, because that can be what leads to the insulin resistance, which also kind of contributes to the onset of this horrible condition. But there are also, you can put herbs in the diet as well to help with their energetic constitution, which is a whole different kettle of fish, probably something to talk about on a different episode. But in terms of kind of like the disharmony and the blood deficiency, and then the damp heat and the spleen deficiency, which is the difference between the fresh food dogs and the processed fed dogs, then for the fresh food dogs, you probably want to be looking at the treating that blood deficiency. So using blood tonic foods and herbs and that kind of thing. And then for the damp heat, you want to be using herbs that are, aromatic and that are going to help push through the dampness and kind of get rid of what's not being used and that kind of thing.
So do you have examples if people are like, where do I even find what would be a blood tonic? What would that look like? Do you have some examples for people?
Yeah, so some blood tonics you can use would be parsley would be an example of a herb, but then there's foods like heart and liver. So by making sure that some of those foods are in the diet, that can help. And then the aromatic herbs are herbs that you would tend to use in the kitchen, like oregano and thyme and things like that. So they're really simple foods to add into the diet. So this is the beauty of creating your own diet as well, because you can literally once you've discovered what your dog needs, and that would be a fresh food diet with some blood tonic kind of foods, then you can find the information to what those are and include those in the diet.
Yeah.
It's so much easier than trying to find a pre-made food that has all of those things in there.
Yeah, you're not going to find it. You're just not going to.
No.
Or there will be there's going to be some ingredient in there that your dog can't tolerate. And so that's going to throw that option out the window. But also something that you mentioned just made me think of sort of like a side note, excuse me, that with the association of dampness with pancreatitis, we often see dampness associated with dogs that have yeast, for example, which also is about a carb fat issue. And so adding in extra things like sweet potatoes, again, I'm more of a fan when it comes to carbs, non-starchy carbs, but I get that some people want to add in starchy carbs. But if you've got a yeasty dog with pancreatitis, I would suggest maybe moving away from that, because the issue is it's true that the yeast doesn't feed off the carbs directly, but the liver converts, again, it's an excess thing, the excess carbs into fat that the yeast then does eat. So then you end up having like two issues going on, which becomes a real issue for your dog's body to kind of manage. So again, it's taking a kind of whole picture of what's going on with your dog, looking at the kind of constitutional things that are showing up. You don't have to be trained in Chinese medicine, like an expert in this, to start to notice what's going on with your dog. Just start to pay attention to what's going on with your dog. And then again, as Kat's saying, like from a DIY perspective, you can start to tweak that. Pull something out. If your dog's not doing great with the sweet potatoes, pull the sweet potato out. That's great. And then you can put other things in that help support them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like you say, it all boils down to the individual dog because you can have dogs that have damp issues which don't have a problem with yeast. So they could benefit from things like sweet potato, especially if the owner's trying to kind of keep the cost down of the recipe, or maybe help, with, keeping the dog satiated and that kind of thing. But then there are on the other half of it, you've got dogs who have like one tiny bit of sweet potato and they've got like a yeast flare up prolifically, which does happen a lot of the time.
Hmm.
So it is again looking at what your dog needs in terms of how to best support them at that time. But I think with pancreatitis, as you said, you want to be staying away from any of the kind of starchy carbohydrates in general, apart from vegetables like your greens and maybe a few berries, which are going to help to feed the microbiome. Um, Once your dog is out of the flare up, because you don't want to be giving any kind of starch or sugars while they're in a flare up, but after that you can put them back in if you want to. And that's kind of the most important thing is dealing with your dog at that particular moment in time to make sure they're getting
Yeah.
what they need in the moment. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on adding in things like digestive enzymes, for example, into the dog's diet after a flare-up? Because I know I've heard mixed things about that. I'm just kind of wondering what your take is on that.
Again, I would do it dog dependent. I think if it looks like they're struggling to digest their food, then it wouldn't hurt to kind of put some in there. But for me, I would always choose adding in some kind of pork pancreas in there, rather than a supplement form, because
Mhm.
especially in the UK, it's really hard to find a digestive enzyme supplement which doesn't have any fillers in it. I mean, um, Adored Beast do one, which is available in the USA. We can't actually get the digestive enzyme blend in the UK as a standalone product. You have to buy it as kind of like as part of I think it's the Yeasty Beast protocol. I'm not 100%
Right.
sure.
I think it is.
Um, yeah, but so anything other than that has got kind of like silicon dioxide and all that kind of stuff in it, which I wouldn't, be advising that you give to these dogs. Um, but there is also the theory that, you feed the organ that's struggling and it helps to replenish the organ, you know, itself. So by feeding some of the pancreas is definitely going to be beneficial, especially if you've got a dysbiosis kind of problem as well, because it's going to be those digestive enzymes that are going to help to get rid of the yeast and anything else that might be causing a problem.
Right.
Um, but I think it depends on the dog and it also depends on the owner as well.
Hmm.
Because in my experience, not everybody's willing to go and get some raw pork pancreas and kind of stick it in the bowl. So it just
Right.
depends on the situation as well.
Right, right. Yeah, and you've got to do the best that you can in any kind of
Yeah.
in any kind of situation. But I'm wondering too then on your thoughts with cooked versus raw, whether or not some dogs with pancreatitis actually who are especially those who are struggling to digest, would you suggest that they might actually consider a gently cooked diet over a raw diet or not?
Always, always. If we know the dog is struggling with pancreatitis, then I would always recommend a cooked diet, at least for a short term until you're well out of the woods, because the body is struggling with something so serious that to put extra pressure on the digestive system to kind of cope with digesting that food, um, it just takes the energy away from dealing with the problem. I mean, it can be done on a raw diet. It's not that it
Mhm.
can't be done. Plenty of dogs recover
Mhm.
on a fresh food diet, depends on the severity of the issue. But I would always recommend a slow cook diet because I just think a sick dog needs the easiest form of nutrients.
I agree. No, I agree. And that's why I talk on the podcast so much about a fresh diet because it really is about
Yeah.
working with the dog in front of you and what's going on for them at any given time. And while we talk about in the industry kind of raw being the best, I think that actually needs to be clarified. And there needs to be a little bit of like what do I want to call it? Like a kind of clause that's attached to that, that it's about best for what, best for who. Because I know like my dog Lucky, he doesn't, fortunately, we've got him through a lot of his health challenges, but he actually prefers and does better with a gently cooked diet. He just does.
Yeah.
And so instead of trying, I mean, I did go through the phase of like trying to get him to eat raw, and he didn't want it. But I offered him the exact same thing in a gently cooked form, and he devoured it. And so I was like, well, he's telling me what
Yeah.
it is that he needs. And so paying attention to that with your dog as well. What are they showing you that
Yeah.
they're into?
Well, I think as well, a lot of the dogs that have the damp heat problems and the spleen deficient problems, the spleen doesn't like coldness, and a raw
Mhm.
food diet is cold. So if you do have a dog that's got a spleen deficiency, they're going to do better with a cooked diet anyway, because it's going to warm their system and it's going to help their organs to thrive in that environment. So if you do have a dog that has that gently cooked will always be better for them. And like you
Yeah.
say, you probably will find that they will prefer it. Now, you don't get me wrong, lots of dogs probably just eat anything that you give to them. I know two of my dogs will, because I have got three dogs now actually. Two of my dogs will eat anything that you give to them. Boris, on the other hand, my epileptic dog, he loves cooked food. He will eat raw, but he's picky with the
Hmm.
raw that he eats. But you give him anything cooked and he will devour it, like no matter
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And if your dog does have a spleen issue going on it, but you really do want to feed raw, or the dog prefers raw, another option too is to just make sure that you bring the food to room temperature before you actually feed it. So let it sit out on the
Yeah.
counter, for example, for like 20-30 minutes. Don't feed it straight out of the fridge where it's, ice cold kind of thing. Are there any other things that you recommend adding into a diet that could be supportive for pancreatitis? Like antioxidants are one thing that I often think about, or are there any other things that you think are beneficial for a dog?
Yeah, so it looks different, as we've mentioned before, if we're dealing with kind of like a flare-up situation where there's severe inflammation happening right now, compared to kind of like a management diet. So in the flare-up diet, you literally want kind of like really lean meat, and you still want some vegetables in there in the form of kind of like leafy greens, so they're low starch, low GI vegetables, no kind of berries in there at the moment, just because you've got to be careful with the sugar, um, and kind of structure it that way until the inflammation has calmed down. But then when you're kind of doing the management diet, this is where you can add the things back in. So you want to look at adding things like the omega 3s back in. So because you've got to be mindful of the fat content, you can try and do it with the oily fish, which can be done. It can be done with the oily fish. If you're in control of what goes in the bowl, you can keep all the meat super lean and give them the oily fish as their fat source, which is going to obviously give them the vitamin D and the omega 3s for the inflammation anyway. Um, but then you also want to get some berries in there, like blueberries and blackberries and things like that, which are going to help with the antioxidants. Always include the veggies. Now, for pets with pancreatitis, I always advise kind of like up to 20% vegetable matter, and that's to nourish the microbiome, because these are the guys that are going to basically help the body get back to fighting fit as well. Um, and then I would just include, like I say, low fat meats. So you can then use the option of the oily fish in there. Because for me, oily fish should be part of every dog's diet, because we live in a world which is just far too toxic and inflammatory not to have a good source of omega 3. You can use fish oils, but I mean, that's a whole different kettle of fish again, I think.
Yeah, no, it is. And I've seen people, and I've often recommended too, where fish might be an option or might not be an option for some dogs. Algae oil is another good option. Like the thing with something like if you're feeding the fish, if you're feeding a small oily fish, you want to think like lowest on the food chain. They're going to have the
Yeah.
least number of toxins versus like a salmon. Not a huge fan of something like salmon or salmon oils for dogs because they can have if they're farmed versus wild caught, there's issues with toxins, all that kind of stuff. But if you're thinking like sardines,
Yeah.
sprats, that kind of thing, you're generally in good stead. I think too, this is I mean it's not directly related to pancreatitis, but I think it's an important thing to bring into the conversation because I love that you take a truly holistic perspective on how we're thinking about our dogs in terms of like what is the stress level in the household. Stress is that can be a contributing factor to pancreatitis. That can be a contributing factor to just, I mean, that's overall health, right? So what are the
Yeah.
stress factors in the home? What are the toxins that are in the home, like cleaning products, all of that kind of, that's sort of a thing that you've got to be aware of, but also what's in our food system and how our food is produced. And one of the questions that I get a lot from listeners who are kind of confused about how to balance omegas. Like they're like, oh, but should I be adding more omega-3? Should I be doing that? How do I think about this? So I'd love to hear your take on it. But one of the things that I think is interesting in terms of how we start thinking about that is recognizing the food system that we're in, that so many of our animals that are reared specifically for food are done so in high stress environments. They're not necessarily fed species appropriate foods, etc. That is going to affect the meat that our dog is
Yeah.
then eating. And so
Yeah.
much of that kind of that environment, that sort of industrial way of producing food leads to meats that are higher in omega-6, the inflammatory fats, which is
Yeah.
why you get the conversation around omega-3s because we're trying to come into balance again. And
Yeah.
things are
Yeah.
not in balance because of how we've raise the food. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on that, especially when it comes to how we're thinking about something like omega-3 with a pancreatitis case.
Yeah, so this is one of the topics I do cover this in the No Fuss Fresh course as well, because I think we tend to kind of underestimate that meat even has omega-6 in it. Like, I think a lot of people don't realize that the meat has an omega profile. And, if we're talking about pasture raised animals who are free to roam, they're happy, they eat wild, plant material, whatever they choose, they will have a pretty well balanced omega ratio. So if you were feeding your dog only that, then you probably wouldn't need to feed the oily fish, which is where the whole concept of whole prey and the 80-10-10 diet comes from,
Mhm.
because it stems from a world which wasn't tainted by humans. But now, because we have intensively reared our meat and we pump them full of hormones and God knows what else, it's likely. I think there was a study that found it tested the different omega ratios of the different proteins, and it found that wild caught animals like hare and venison had like a 4-to-1 omega-6-to-3 ratio and like a 5-to-1, and yet intensively reared animals like pigs and chickens and cows, they had like 10-to-1, 11-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. So they are more pro-inflammatory than what they are,
Mhm.
anti-inflammatory, which is why when you learn about the food and you learn about what you're feeding your pets, it's not just about whether it's chicken or beef, it's about how it's being reared. And this
Mhm.
goes for people as well, not just for your pets. This is,
Right.
everybody eats. Then when you learn about things like that, that's why you begin to understand why you need those omega-3s in there. And it used to be said that feeding oily fish 3 times a week would be sufficient to kind of balance out the omegas. But if you're feeding your dog inflammatory meat every single day, you need to be doing something to counteract that every single day as well, which is why I always typically recommend to feed 10% of, oily fish in the diet if you can. If not, then you need to use the algae oil or something like that to get them in there. But I think you do have to be careful, obviously, with pancreatitis, especially if you're managing a flare up kind of condition,
Yeah.
because fat can be one of the contributing factors to make the condition worse. So that's when it really pays to kind of work with somebody who knows how to look at the diet, how to look at the different components of the diet, not just in a protein, carb, and fat context, but in a protein as in amino acids, all the breakdowns of different fats kind of context as well, which is again where things like the diet formulator tools come in really useful when you're trying to
Yeah.
structure these diets for these dogs. Because I mean, naturally I would follow a balance over time approach, because I believe that Mother Nature knows what she's doing with the nutrients best. But when you do have a case which is so serious, you have to pay attention to what is in the food. So you can use tools like the diet formulators to make sure that you're keeping the levels under the threshold, which is what I would do with my pancreatic clients as well, to make sure that it's a safe kind of value for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I absolutely agree with all of that because I also think that in general, for a healthy adult dog, yes, you can follow the kind of general guidance of balance over time and sort of ratios. But when it comes to a serious health condition, that's where you do want some extra help. And I always refer to those the tools as providing guidelines. They are guidelines.
Yeah.
But what we
Hmm.
need to know what it is that we're starting with and working with, and then we can tweak that for your individual dog. So if your dog isn't
Yeah.
doing well on a certain percentage of whatever, then we can fiddle with it a little bit more, have a little bit more finesse with it to find that sweet spot that works for your dog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Can you tell us a little bit about the course that you offer for people who want to learn more about doing DIY?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have two things. I have a course which is an in-depth kind of, it's a video taught series of, well, lessons, yeah, they're lessons, where I basically teach you how to go fully into DIY for your dog. You get to learn about what the food is that's needed in the bowl, why it's needed there, how much of it is needed there, how to kind of identify your dog's own unique individual needs and support them. It comes with like a tool which takes you through step by step from figuring out how much your dog needs to eat, how to check their body condition, and either help them lose weight or put weight on, what kind of ratios to stick with in terms of the different organ meats and the muscular organs and the raw meaty bones. It tells you how to pick the raw meaty bones and how much of each one to put in. And then once you've kind of like dealt with the whole bill in the bowl kind of thing, you get like a series of modules which go into the detail of how to prepare the food, little tips and tricks about sourcing the food, different ways you can adapt the lifestyle in looking at vaccinations and flea and tick treatments and other areas of life that might bring kind of like stress and toxins and things like that. So it's essentially my Bible of a holistic dog lifestyle, which pieces together all of the information that I have learned over the years in order for you to basically just, kind of read it and follow it and implement those steps. If you want to implement them all, then that's fabulous. If you want to just do the DIY, that's fine. But the reason I created it was because when I first started on my journey, I had to go to various different sources and I was so confused for a long time in what kind of the best thing to do for my dogs as individuals would be. And I had to piece different bits of information together and I hope that something would stick. Um, and I could have really done with a tool like this when I was learning about it.
Me
Something that
too.
basic something that basically said, do this, do this, do this, put this amount of this in, put this amount of this in, don't put this in at this point, put it in there. It was just like all of these little bits that I basically had on like a million bits of paper that I've put into a program so that pet parents can, have something that consistent to follow. And then there's the guide, which is like a fast track version where if you kind of already feeding raw and you already know about the benefits of the raw meaty bones and why they need to be in there, it just gives you a rundown of how to build the bowl from start to finish. And includes the same tool, which gives you step by step. Like the first step is choose your raw meaty bone, and then it's like choose your muscle meats and there's lists and everything in there. So it's literally you could come into it from beginner level,
Oh,
but there is a
amazing.
lot of information. So
That's amazing. And is it self-paced? Is it something that people can do at their own pace?
yeah, absolutely,
Brilliant.
absolutely. So you could, if you did it, I worked out that if you did it for 30 minutes a day, um, if you watched 30 minutes of the videos a day and you absorbed it and took it on board, you could go from naught to fresh in 30 days. So by the end of it, you'd be, well equipped to prepare your own raw food meals. I also offer like a little bonus, which is a DIY workshop. So prep with it as well. So once you've kind of been through the materials and you're ready to do your prep, you can jump on to a Google Meet with me and we'll kind of prep some food together. And then if you've got any questions that you have while you're doing it, because sometimes you can't think of a question until you're in the moment. And then you're like, well, what do I do now? Because it's
Right.
hard to think of a situation until you're actually working it. So that's a little bonus of it as well. And then there's also kind of like monthly coaching calls. If you've got any questions about the program or about, I've tried this with my dog and he's got a runny bum, what should I do? you can jump on the coaching call and ask your questions live with me, and I'll answer them there and then for you, which is another little perk. Because again, I had questions. I was like, who can I ask? Who's going to answer this for me? And I just wanted to be able to support people into their journey. There is the first module focuses on confidence as well, because I think a lot of pet parents lack the confidence,
Mm-hmm.
and they actually don't believe that they can do it themselves, which, it's, you absolutely can. So we do look at ways in which you can kind of harness that inner confidence in order to inspire you to kind of take the leap and say, I'm excited to try it, rather than I'm scared I'm going to mess it up.
Right. Right. Oh, I love that so much, Kat. Where can people find out information on that? Where's a good place to reach you with it?
My Instagram is pretty much the only place that I am active at the moment, just because I don't have many spare brain cells for any other social media platform at this moment in time. So it's literally just Instagram, and it's at bemoredog.nutrition, and that's where you can find me and all of the programs and guides and things that I offer as well.
Perfect. And I'll leave that link in the show notes so people can click directly from there. This has been so amazing. Thank you so much for just like your wisdom and energy and really helping a lot of people at a time where this might creep up in their lives with their dogs, and giving them a little bit of guidance on how to go about supporting their dogs and themselves through it. So thank you for
Yeah,
that.
no, you're absolutely welcome. I mean, the only thing I want to do is to help pet parents do the best for their dogs. And if I can give, any help and advice in doing that, then that's what I want to do. It's not just about helping the dogs that I see one to one. It's about, getting people on the fresh food train, giving them the confidence that they know what they need to do. And remember, we're not saying you can't feed them a treat at Thanksgiving. Just give them some of the lean meat rather than the skin.
Right.
And that will be okay.
Exactly, exactly. Thank you for pointing that out. Absolutely. I wanted to ask you one last question that I ask all of my guests, and that is if you want to reflect on a particular one of your dogs or your dogs generally, what do you feel like they have taught you about what it means to be human?
Oh, honestly, what it means to be human. Um, I think my dogs have taught me that the human race has got a long way to go to be able to deserve the dogs that they are blessed with. Not necessarily the people that we work with, because there are, many of us, but I think dogs are so forgiving, and they just love you unconditionally, no matter what, whether you're in a bad mood, whether you smell bad, whether you look bad, whatever is going on, they just absolutely love you so much. And particularly Boris, for me, learning that Boris has stress related epilepsy really kind of made me look more inward into managing my own stress. So when I look back, and because I've got calendars for every year that he has, see, with all his seizures listed on, and when I look back at the patterns, the times where his seizures are more frequent are the times where I have been dealing with something big or small or just something. And even now, he is so sensitive to kind of like what mood I'm in and things like
Mhm.
that. So by focusing on my own energy and my own stress, and keeping everything kind of like at a nice steady level, helps me to manage his condition as well, which I think that has to be one of the most valuable lessons I have learned from him, is
What a
that,
gift.
stress stress is a big impact.
Absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that. I love that because, I talk about very often on the podcast that one of the reasons that I think that dogs are in our lives at kind of like a more spiritual level is that they are our sacred mirrors. And I never mean this in a kind of judgmental way. I just mean that the gift of the mirror is that it gives you a different perspective. How you choose to see that and what you choose to do with that is your prerogative, right? But we can't do something about, we can't make a change until we're aware that something's there that needs to be changed, or that we could just do something differently if that was what was needed. And I think we always get the dogs in our lives that we need to show us with
Yeah.
what we're struggling with
Hmm.
via them. And so that is a huge gift. That's a huge gift.
Yeah.
Oh, I
Yeah,
love it.
definitely.
Kat, thank you so
Definitely.
much. We'll definitely have to have you back on to talk more things, how we approach. I love having these conversations with other people who are dealing with nutrition and have a similar ethos of we can do so much to support our dogs through diet. It's like the thing that you have control over for your
Yeah.
dog and feeling that sense of agency and becoming the advocate for your dog, which then in turn allows you to become the advocate for yourself. So we definitely have to come back and have more conversations.
Absolutely. And I think the most rewarding thing about it as well is when you implement these strategies and you take control of the diet and you see in front of you the benefits and how it changes things. That is the most magnificent thing because then you can turn around and say, well, I actually did that because I took control and I took responsibility and now we're living this beautiful life. Whereas before it was a struggle. But I mean, sometimes it can take you a while to get there, but it is achievable for everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for leaving people with that. Thank you so
Thank
thank
you. Thank you so
you.
much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for joining me for my conversation with Kat Jepson. Isn't she wonderful? I hope this was helpful for you. If you want to know more about pancreatitis and the impact of diet, Dr. Connor Brady's book Feeding Dogs, as well as his website dogsfirst.ie, are really informative. He raises some interesting questions around whether or not high carbs in the diet might actually be just as problematic as fats when it comes to pancreatitis. So check out his work for some other perspectives. There are also helpful resources on the Dogs Naturally magazine website, and I'll leave these links in the show notes. To connect with Kat about her courses and all of her other offerings, please visit her Instagram, bemoredog.nutrition. She didn't mention this, but Kat also has her own podcast, My Dog Made Me Do It Naturally. She talks with pet parents and professionals about navigating their journeys with their pets into the world of natural health. So be sure to check that out wherever you listen to podcasts. If there are any other topics you'd like me to cover on the podcast, or there are any aspects of nourishing your dog or yourself, mind, body, and soul, that you're struggling with and like to hear a little bit more about, please let me know. You can get in touch on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama, leave a note in the YouTube comments, or contact me on my website, mysticdogmama.com. I want to make sure that I'm providing you with content that you find helpful on your journey with your dog, so definitely let me know how I can support you. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the podcast to be notified when I release a new episode. And if you're enjoying the content, please consider leaving a review. This tells the algorithm to put the podcast in front of other Mystic Dog Mamas and Papas who are looking for support to best nourish their dogs too. And if you have already subscribed and left a review, thank you. I'm truly so grateful. Okay, until next time.